My son said I was too reckless, too careless, and too irresponsible with money to deserve his help anymore. So he canceled the financial support he'd been providing, lectured me about fiscal discipline, and treated my budget struggles like character flaws that needed correction. But I wasn't reckless. I wasn't careless. While he thought cutting me off would teach me responsibility, I was planning to show him what real financial loss looked like when the person who taught him everything about money decided his savings weren't worth protecting anymore. He'd learned that the most expensive lesson in fiscal responsibility comes when someone who truly understands money decides to destroy everything you've built. I raised Michael as a single mother after my husband Paul was paralyzed in a construction accident when Michael was 15. Paul didn't abandon us. He couldn't work anymore, spending his days in physical therapy and dealing with chronic pain that workers' compensation barely covered. I became the sole breadwinner overnight, taking a job as a bookkeeper at Henderson Manufacturing while also managing Paul's medical care and keeping our family financially afloat during the most challenging period of our lives. Those years of crisis taught me more about money management than any business school curriculum could have provided. I learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed, to find deals that kept us fed and housed while paying for Paul's medications and equipment. I taught Michael the value of careful budgeting by example, showing him how to track expenses, comparison shop, and make every purchase count toward our family's survival. We clipped coupons together on Sunday afternoons, planned meals around grocery store sales, and found creative ways to make birthdays and holidays special without breaking our carefully managed budget. Michael learned fiscal responsibility not from textbooks but from watching his mother perform daily miracles with insufficient resources. When Michael graduated high school, I'd somehow managed to save enough money to help with his college expenses, even while supporting Paul's ongoing medical needs and maintaining our household on a bookkeeper's salary. I worked overtime shifts to pay for Michael's textbooks, sent him care packages filled with homemade cookies when I couldn't afford store-bought snacks, and celebrated every academic achievement like it was a personal victory against the financial odds we'd been fighting for years. Michael graduated with a business degree and immediately landed a job at a prestigious accounting firm, launching the successful career I'd sacrificed so much to make possible. Paul passed away 5 years later from complications related to his injury, leaving me with funeral expenses and the reality of living on a bookkeeper's salary without his disability payments to supplement our income. Michael was established in his career by then, married to Linda and living in a beautiful suburban home with all the markers of financial success. He'd started helping me financially without being asked, sending monthly checks that made the difference between comfortable retirement and constant worry about bills. I was grateful for his support and proud that my son had become the kind of man who took care of his aging mother through voluntary generosity rather than grudging obligation. The first crack in our relationship came when Michael learned I'd been giving money to my neighbor, Mrs. Santos, whose husband had been laid off from the factory where he'd worked for 15 years. She was struggling to buy groceries for her 3 young children, and I'd been quietly slipping her $20 here and there when I knew she was having particularly difficult weeks. The money came from my own grocery budget. I'd eat less so her children could eat more. When Michael discovered this during one of his monthly financial check-ins, his reaction was swift and judgmental. "Mom, you can't afford to be giving away money when you're living on my support," he said, his voice carrying the stern tone he probably used with clients who made poor financial decisions. "Mrs. Santos needs to figure out her own budget problems instead of relying on charity from someone who can't spare the money. You're enabling her dependence instead of encouraging her to find sustainable solutions to her financial crisis." He spoke about my neighbor like she was a business case study rather than a struggling mother who needed temporary help from someone who understood what it meant to choose between groceries and utilities. The second betrayal came when Michael discovered I'd been making small donations to the church's food pantry, the same program that had helped us during Paul's early recovery when medical bills consumed most of our income and left us choosing between rent and groceries. I'd been contributing $10 a month, a tiny amount that helped stock the pantry that had once fed my own family during our darkest financial period. Michael was appalled by what he called my irresponsible charitable giving that demonstrated poor understanding of my financial position. "Mom, charity begins at home. You're taking money that should be going toward your own expenses and giving it away to programs that have professional funding sources and paid staff to manage their operations. This isn't financially sound behavior for someone in your position who relies on family support to maintain basic living standards. He made my gratitude sound like fiscal irresponsibility, my desire to give back sound like poor money management that needed professional correction and family intervention. The third betrayal was the most personal because it involved Michael's growing resentment about providing financial support at all. During a family dinner at their house, Linda mentioned their plans to renovate their kitchen with granite countertops and professional appliances, and I made a casual comment about how much I appreciated Michael's monthly help because it allowed me to live comfortably rather than just surviving paycheck to paycheck like I had during Paul's illness. Michael's response revealed how much his attitude toward helping me had changed since he'd started viewing it as a burden rather than a privilege. "Mom, that monthly check represents a significant portion of our discretionary income that we could be using for home improvements, vacations, or additional retirement savings. Linda and I have been talking about whether we can continue this arrangement long term, especially since you seem to think it's appropriate to give away money we're sending you for your own support." He was treating my gratitude like entitlement and my small acts of generosity like fiscal betrayals that justified cutting off support to his own mother. The breaking point came 6 months later when Michael arrived at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, carrying a clipboard and wearing the same expression he probably used during financial audits at work. He'd clearly been planning this confrontation for weeks, organizing his arguments and gathering evidence to support his case against my fiscal management. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your spending habits and financial responsibility. Linda and I have been reviewing your situation, and we're concerned about your decision-making when it comes to money management." He spoke like I was a client whose accounts he was reviewing rather than the mother who'd taught him everything he knew about surviving financial hardship. He'd brought bank statements he'd somehow obtained, receipts he'd been collecting during visits to my house, and a detailed analysis of how I'd been spending the money he sent each month. Every small purchase was categorized and questioned. The flowers I'd bought for Paul's grave on the anniversary of his death, the modest birthday gifts for my grandchildren that cost less than what Michael spent on lunch, the small donations that represented less than 2% of my monthly budget. Michael had reduced my life to a spreadsheet and found it wanting according to his professional standards of fiscal efficiency. "Mom, you're spending money on non-essential items while accepting financial support from Linda and me. That's not responsible behavior for someone who claims to need help with basic expenses. These charitable donations and discretionary purchases suggest that you don't actually need the assistance we've been providing, or that you're using our generosity to fund lifestyle choices that exceed your actual financial capacity." The word claims hit me like a physical blow, suggesting that my need for assistance was somehow fraudulent rather than the natural result of living on a fixed income that hadn't kept pace with rising costs. The conversation that followed revealed how completely Michael had misunderstood both my financial situation and my character. He accused me of taking advantage of his generosity, of using his support to fund frivolous expenses, instead of limiting myself to bare necessities that he deemed appropriate for someone receiving family assistance. When I tried to explain that the money he sent allowed me to live with dignity rather than mere survival, he dismissed my perspective as emotional justification for poor financial choices that demonstrate lack of appreciation for family support. "Michael," I said carefully, trying to control the anger building in my chest, "I taught you about money management when we had nothing. I showed you how to budget during the hardest years of our lives when your father was disabled and we were living on my bookkeeper's salary. I worked overtime shifts to pay for your college education while supporting your father's medical needs and maintaining our household. Do you really think I suddenly forgot how to handle money responsibly after decades of successful financial management under far more difficult circumstances than what I'm facing now?" But he was already shaking his head, convinced that age and emotional thinking had compromised my fiscal judgment in ways that required family intervention and professional correction. "That was different, Mom. You were working then, earning money that was yours to spend however you chose. Now you're living on assistance from family members, which comes with different responsibilities and expectations. Linda and I can't continue supporting someone who treats our help like disposable income for non-essential purchases and charitable giving that should be suspended until you achieve true financial independence." That afternoon, Michael informed me he'd be ending the monthly financial support effective immediately. This will force you to create a realistic budget based on your actual income rather than relying on external support for discretionary spending that exceeds appropriate limits for someone in your financial position. He spoke like he was doing me a favor, teaching me important lessons about fiscal responsibility that I'd somehow never learned despite decades of successful money management under far more difficult circumstances than he'd ever faced in his comfortable suburban lifestyle. After Michael left that day, I sat at my kitchen table looking at the budget analysis he'd left behind, seeing my life reduced to columns of numbers that somehow justified cutting off support to the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. The irony was breathtaking. The son I'd taught to value financial security was creating financial insecurity for his own mother because he disapproved of my spending priorities and questioned my fiscal judgment. If Michael thought I was financially irresponsible, perhaps it was time to show him what real fiscal recklessness looked like when applied with strategic intelligence and decades of accumulated financial knowledge. I spent the next few days reviewing my own financial records, not to find areas to cut expenses but to remember exactly how much I'd invested in Michael's future over the years. The college contributions that had required overtime shifts and weekend work, the textbook money that meant I wore the same winter coat for 5 years, the graduation gifts that came from my emergency savings, the down payment assistance for his first apartment that depleted my vacation fund, the emergency loans during his early career that I never asked him to repay, thousands of dollars that had flowed from my modest bookkeeper's salary to his bright financial future. The following week, I made an appointment with Janet Morrison, the financial advisor who'd helped me manage Paul's insurance settlement and plan for retirement. Janet had known our family for years, had watched me manage money through Paul's illness and recovery, and understood that my financial decisions had always been sound and carefully considered despite our modest income and challenging circumstances. "Janet, I need to discuss some changes to my investment strategy and estate planning," I said calmly. "Recent conversations with my family have made me reconsider some of my financial priorities and long-term goals." I also began researching Michael's financial situation more thoroughly than I'd ever bothered to before, using the same analytical skills that had made me successful in bookkeeping for 20 years. As someone who understood how to read financial documents, trace investment patterns, and identify potential vulnerabilities in seemingly secure financial plans, I had advantages that Michael never suspected his fiscally irresponsible mother possessed. Michael had always been proud of his investment portfolio, his growing retirement accounts, his carefully planned financial future built on professional expertise and sophisticated strategies. But every financial plan had weak points, and every investor had blind spots that could be exploited by someone with enough knowledge, motivation, and strategic thinking ability. Over the next few weeks, I started building relationships with people who had access to information about Michael's financial activities and professional network. Not to spy exactly, but to understand the full scope of his fiscal security so I could determine the best way to demonstrate what real financial loss felt like when engineered by someone he'd dismissed as irresponsible. If he thought my small charitable donations were fiscally reckless, he was about to learn what genuine financial destruction could accomplish when applied with careful planning, strategic thinking, and the kind of money management expertise he'd somehow forgotten I possessed. I started with Michael's most vulnerable investment, the rental property he'd purchased 2 years earlier as a long-term investment and source of passive income. He'd mentioned the property several times during family dinners, proud of the steady rental income that supplemented his salary and contributed to his retirement planning without requiring active management or significant time investment. What he didn't realize was that I'd been the one to recommend that specific neighborhood, based on my knowledge of planned development projects and municipal improvements that would increase property values over time. I knew that area better than he did, including detailed information about upcoming changes that could dramatically affect his investment's profitability. The first phase of my plan involved subtle market manipulation through my extensive connections in the local real estate community. I'd maintained professional relationships with several real estate agents, property managers, and municipal officials through my bookkeeping work over the years, people who trusted my judgment about neighborhood trends, property values, and development patterns that affected investment decisions. When I began mentioning concerns about potential issues affecting Michael's rental property area, concerns based on my intimate knowledge of municipal planning documents and infrastructure problems that most investors never researched, these professionals took my warnings seriously and began spreading cautious advice through their networks. Within weeks, carefully orchestrated negative rumors about the neighborhood began circulating through real estate professional networks. Nothing false or illegal, just strategic emphasis on genuine concerns that most investors overlooked. Pending zoning changes that could affect residential property values, infrastructure problems that would require costly special assessments, demographic shifts that could reduce rental demand and property appreciation rates. Real estate markets respond to perception as much as reality, and perception could be influenced systematically by someone with the right connections and sufficient motivation for subtle, long-term market manipulation. Meanwhile, I began the process of restructuring my own investments in ways that would indirectly impact Michael's financial planning assumptions and inheritance expectations. Janet helped me liquidate several accounts that Michael assumed would eventually become part of his inheritance, redirecting that money toward investments and charitable commitments he knew nothing about. If he thought I was financially irresponsible with small charitable donations, then perhaps he didn't deserve to inherit the results of my careful financial planning and successful money management over the years. The most satisfying part of my plan involved leveraging my decades of bookkeeping experience to identify vulnerabilities in Michael's tax planning and investment strategies. Through careful observation during family visits and casual conversations about his professional activities, I'd learned enough about his financial strategies to recognize several potential compliance issues that could trigger costly audits or penalties if brought to the attention of the appropriate regulatory authorities. Not through illegal reporting or false accusations, but through legitimate questions about complex investment structures that appear to push the boundaries of proper documentation and reporting requirements. I also began building strategic relationships within Michael's professional network, attending community events and business functions where I might encounter his colleagues, clients, and professional contacts. As his mother and someone with extensive bookkeeping experience and professional credentials, I was naturally positioned to share insights about his character, judgment, and family relationships during casual conversations. When discussions turned to family values and personal integrity, I was always truthful about recent events. My son had chosen to cut off financial support to his aging mother because he disapproved of her modest charitable giving and questioned her fiscal responsibility despite decades of successful money management. The real estate manipulation campaign succeeded beyond my most optimistic expectations. Property values in Michael's rental neighborhood began declining steadily as negative perceptions spread through professional networks and potential buyers heard concerns about the area's future prospects. Rental demand decreased significantly as prospective tenants received warnings about infrastructure problems, zoning issues, and demographic changes that could affect their living experience. Within 3 months, Michael was dealing with extended vacancy periods, declining property values, and mounting expenses for repairs and maintenance on a property that had been generating steady passive income for 2 years. When Michael called to complain about his rental property problems, I listened sympathetically while privately celebrating the success of my careful market manipulation and strategic networking efforts. "That's terrible, honey," I said with genuine concern in my voice. "Real estate can be so unpredictable, especially when you don't have complete information about all the factors that affect property values. I hope you didn't invest more than you could afford to lose in that rental property." The irony was perfect. I was using his own risk management language and investment advice while discussing the financial losses I'd engineered through careful planning and strategic market influence. 6 months after Michael cut off my financial support, he called me on a Tuesday evening with panic in his voice that I hadn't heard since his college years when he'd faced academic crises that threatened his scholarship eligibility. "Mom, I'm having some serious financial problems and I need to ask you for help. I know this is incredibly awkward given our recent conversations about money management and fiscal responsibility, but I'm in real trouble here and I don't know where else to turn." The desperation in his tone was music to my ears, sweet validation that my careful financial planning and strategic market manipulation had achieved exactly the devastating results I'd intended. The rental property situation had deteriorated far beyond Michael's worst-case projections and risk management scenarios. Not only were property values declining steadily, but he'd discovered extensive structural problems that required expensive emergency repairs, insurance coverage gaps that weren't fully protecting his investment, and tenant disputes that were costly to resolve through legal proceedings. What had been a steady source of passive income and long-term wealth building had transformed into a financial nightmare that was draining his savings faster than his salary could replenish them, threatening his entire financial stability. "How much trouble are we talking about here?" I asked with calm concern, though I already knew the precise answer through my various information sources and strategic monitoring of his situation. Michael had been forced to cover rental property expenses from his personal emergency savings, rapidly depleting the financial reserves he'd spent years building through careful budgeting and disciplined investment strategies. The rental property that was supposed to secure his financial future and provide retirement income had become a massive liability that threatened his immediate fiscal stability and long-term financial goals. "I'm looking at approximately $40,000 in immediate expenses, emergency property repairs, legal fees for tenant disputes, carrying costs while the property remains vacant, plus additional reserves needed for ongoing maintenance and marketing efforts to find reliable tenants. I've got maybe half of it covered from my emergency fund, but I need to borrow against my retirement accounts if I can't find another source of funding. I was hoping you might be able to help, maybe from Dad's insurance money or your retirement savings that you've been managing so carefully all these years." The irony was absolutely breathtaking. The son who'd lectured me extensively about fiscal responsibility and questioned my money management skills was now desperately asking for emergency financial assistance from the mother he'd accused of being irresponsible with money and undeserving of family support. The same man who'd cut off my modest monthly assistance because he disapproved of my charitable giving was now begging for tens of thousands of dollars to cover the consequences of his own investment decisions. "Michael," I said thoughtfully, choosing my words with the same deliberate care he'd used when cutting off my support, "this is exactly the kind of financial crisis situation you were warning me about when you ended my monthly assistance. You made an investment decision that seemed sound at the time, and now you're facing serious consequences that require emergency funding. Maybe this is a valuable learning opportunity about the importance of maintaining adequate emergency reserves instead of overextending yourself on speculative investments that carry significant risk factors." The silence that followed my response was heavy with Michael's growing realization that I was systematically using his own language, logic, and moral judgments to decline his desperate request for financial help. The same arguments he'd used to justify cutting off support to his own mother were now being applied to his crisis, and he was discovering how those principles felt when he was the one facing financial devastation without family assistance. "Mom, this isn't the same thing at all. This was a carefully researched investment based on sound financial principles, not frivolous spending on unnecessary charitable donations. I'm not asking for money to fund discretionary expenses or lifestyle choices. This is a legitimate financial emergency that threatens everything I've worked years to build. Surely you can see the difference between responsible investment that encountered unexpected problems and irresponsible spending on things that exceed one's actual financial capacity." But I was already shaking my head, fully prepared to demonstrate exactly how his cold logic felt when applied to someone else's financial crisis and desperate need for family support. "Honey, I learned some very important lessons about financial responsibility after our last conversation about my spending habits. I can't afford to be giving away money when I'm living on a fixed income that you determined was barely adequate for my own needs. You taught me that charity begins at home, and that I need to focus on my own financial security instead of bailing out people who made poor financial decisions that they should have anticipated and prepared for more carefully." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Michael cycling through various increasingly desperate arguments about why his situation was completely different from mine, why he deserved emergency financial assistance from family members, why parents should help their adult children during genuine financial crises rather than allowing them to suffer the full consequences of investment decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time. Each argument was met systematically with his own logic turned back on him. The critical importance of living within one's means, the moral danger of relying on external support instead of personal financial reserves, the character-building necessity of accepting full responsibility for financial decisions rather than expecting others to absorb the negative consequences. "Mom, you don't understand the complete scope of what I'm dealing with here. This isn't just about one problematic investment property. It's affecting my entire financial plan, my retirement savings, my ability to maintain mortgage payments on our house. I could lose everything I've worked 20 years to build, everything that represents financial security for Linda and me. This is about preserving a lifetime of careful financial planning that's being threatened by circumstances beyond my reasonable control. His voice was breaking with the same kind of raw desperation I'd felt when he cut off my support. The existential fear that comes from watching financial security disappear despite decades of careful planning, hard work, and responsible money management. The panic of realizing that family members who'd once provided support could withdraw that assistance based on disapproval of your financial choices, leaving you completely alone to face devastating circumstances that exceeded your individual capacity to resolve. "I understand perfectly what you're experiencing," I said with calm compassion that barely masked my satisfaction. "You're learning what it feels like when someone you depend on decides you're not worth helping anymore. You're discovering that financial security is incredibly fragile, that disasters can strike anyone regardless of their careful planning and professional expertise, and that family support can disappear suddenly when someone questions your judgment about money management. These are extremely valuable lessons about fiscal responsibility that you tried so hard to teach me, and now you get to learn them through direct personal experience." But Michael's financial problems were only beginning to reach their full devastating scope. The tax compliance issues I'd carefully identified and strategically reported were starting to attract serious official attention, triggered by legitimate questions about complex investment structures that appeared to violate certain reporting requirements and documentation standards. Nothing illegal had been done deliberately, but the comprehensive audit process was proving expensive and time-consuming, requiring professional tax attorneys whose fees were quickly consuming what remained of Michael's emergency savings and borrowing capacity. When Michael called to update me about the federal tax audit that was now consuming his life, his voice carried a complete defeat I'd never heard from him before. "Mom, this audit process is absolutely destroying me financially. The legal fees alone are going to cost more than I make in 6 months, and that's assuming they don't find any issues that require penalties or back payments. I don't understand how this happened. I've always been so meticulous about compliance and proper documentation. My accountant says someone must have reported concerns about my investment structures, but I can't imagine who would do that or why." The confusion and betrayal in his voice was genuinely painful to hear, because he truly didn't understand that financial disasters could strike anyone regardless of their careful planning and responsible behavior, especially when those disasters were being systematically engineered by someone with sufficient knowledge, motivation, and strategic capabilities. "That's absolutely terrible, sweetheart," I said with appropriate sympathy. "Tax audits can be so unpredictable and devastating. But I'm sure you'll figure out how to handle this crisis. You're very resourceful and intelligent, and you've always been so skilled with money management. I have complete confidence that you'll find a way to manage this situation without relying on external family support." The final devastating blow came when Michael's employment situation became seriously affected by the mounting financial stress that was consuming his attention and undermining his professional performance. The tax audit and rental property crisis had been demanding so much of his time and mental energy that his work quality began suffering noticeably. His supervisor had observed the decline in focus and productivity, and Michael was struggling desperately to maintain the professional standards that had built his successful career and earned him respect within the firm. "I think I'm going to lose my job," Michael confessed during what would prove to be our last conversation about his comprehensive financial crisis. "I can't concentrate properly on client work when I'm dealing with all these other overwhelming problems. My billable hours are down, I'm making mistakes on important projects, and I can feel the partners losing confidence in my capabilities. And if I lose my income on top of everything else, I'll lose absolutely everything. The house, all my investments, the retirement accounts, everything I've worked 20 years to build through careful planning and disciplined financial management." The complete panic in his voice was devastating to hear, the sound of someone watching their entire financial foundation crumble systematically despite decades of careful planning, professional success, and responsible money management. He was experiencing the same helpless terror I'd felt when he cut off my support, but magnified exponentially because his losses were comprehensive rather than merely the withdrawal of supplemental assistance. "Michael, that sounds incredibly stressful and overwhelming," I said, maintaining the same calm, measured tone he'd used when explaining why he couldn't continue supporting me financially. "But you know what? Sometimes losing everything teaches us important lessons about what really matters in life. Maybe this comprehensive financial crisis will help you develop better priorities, like understanding that family relationships are more valuable than investment portfolios, and that treating people with compassion is more important than judging their financial choices according to your personal standards of fiscal responsibility. The silence that followed was filled with Michael's dawning recognition that his complete financial ruin had been systematically engineered by the same mother he'd accused of fiscal irresponsibility and dismissed as unworthy of continued family support. The timing was too perfect, the scope too comprehensive, the targeting too precise to be coincidental. "Did you do this to me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you somehow cause all these problems because I cut off your financial support?" "Oh, honey," I said with gentle concern, "I would never do anything to deliberately hurt your financial security or professional reputation. I'm just someone you considered too fiscally irresponsible with money to deserve continued family support. How could someone like me possibly understand complex investment strategies well enough to cause the kind of sophisticated financial problems you're experiencing? You're giving me far too much credit for strategic thinking and market manipulation capabilities." The denial was technically truthful while making it absolutely clear that his comprehensive financial ruin was directly connected to his cruel treatment of me. Michael's increasingly desperate attempts to rebuild his financial stability failed spectacularly over the following months, each effort undermined by the systematic destruction I'd engineered through careful planning and strategic market manipulation. The rental property had to be sold at a massive loss that consumed years of savings. The tax audit resulted in substantial penalties and back payments that eliminated his remaining financial reserves. The employment problems led to termination and difficulty finding comparable work due to professional reputation damage. Within 18 months, the son who'd lectured me extensively about fiscal responsibility had lost virtually everything he'd spent decades building through careful planning and disciplined money management. The most satisfying moment of vindication came when Michael had to sell his beautiful suburban home with the granite countertops and professional appliances, forced to move into a modest apartment that represented the same kind of lifestyle downsizing he'd suggested I should consider when he cut off my financial support. The man who'd questioned my spending on flowers for my deceased husband's grave was now unable to afford basic home maintenance, learning firsthand what financial insecurity actually felt like when stripped of family support during a genuine crisis. 3 years have passed since Michael's comprehensive financial collapse, and our relationship has settled into the carefully polite distance that reflects the permanent consequences of the choices we both made during that transformative period. Michael has slowly begun the long process of rebuilding his financial stability from almost nothing, working longer hours at a significantly lower salary, living in modest circumstances that remind him daily of what he lost through his poor judgment about family relationships and fiscal priorities. He's learned through direct experience that financial security is incredibly fragile, that disasters can strike anyone regardless of their careful planning and professional expertise, and that family support is precious precisely because it's often the only safety net that truly matters during genuine crises. I live very comfortably now on my bookkeeper's pension and the investment returns from carefully managing Paul's insurance settlement over the decades since his death. The money I once used to help Michael has been redirected toward causes and people that understand the crucial difference between financial responsibility and financial cruelty, between fiscal discipline and heartless control over other people's spending choices. Mrs. Santos and her family received substantial assistance during their extended crisis period, help that kept them housed and fed until her husband found steady employment again after months of unemployment. The church food pantry received a large endowment that significantly expanded their services to help more families avoid the kind of desperate choices I once faced during Paul's recovery. The most deeply satisfying part of my new financial independence is the freedom to be genuinely generous without someone constantly questioning my fiscal judgment or treating my compassionate choices as evidence of irresponsible money management. I help neighbors during emergencies without justifying every expenditure, support causes that matter to me without defending my priorities to judgmental family members, and give meaningful gifts to my grandchildren without having to explain why their happiness is worth more than maintaining maximum savings balances. This is what true financial security actually looks like: having sufficient resources to live with dignity while also contributing meaningfully to the well-being of others who need temporary assistance during difficult periods. Michael calls occasionally now, usually around major holidays or my birthday, maintaining the kind of respectful but distant relationship that acknowledges our fundamentally changed dynamic without pretending nothing significant happened between us. He's never directly apologized for cutting off my support or admitted that his judgment about my fiscal responsibility was completely wrong, but his careful comments about his own ongoing financial struggles make it crystal clear that he understands now how devastating it feels when family members withdraw assistance based solely on disapproval of spending choices that represent different values and priorities. The hardest part of our current relationship isn't missing Michael's financial support. I never actually needed his assistance, having managed my finances successfully for decades before he started helping and continuing to do so after he stopped. The most difficult aspect is mourning the son I thought I'd raised, someone who would understand that family relationships require compassion rather than control, generosity rather than harsh judgment, unconditional support during difficult times rather than lectures about fiscal responsibility that mask fundamental selfishness and lack of empathy. But I've also discovered something profoundly valuable through this experience of enforced financial independence. Money managed with compassion and generosity creates far more genuine security than money hoarded through fear and selfishness. The relationships I've built through generous giving, the community support network I've received during my own difficult periods, the deep sense of purpose that comes from helping others navigate financial crises. These human connections provide security and meaning that investment portfolios and savings accounts can never match or replace. My financial decisions are guided now by principles Michael never learned despite his expensive business education and professional success. That money is fundamentally a tool for creating human connection rather than exercising control over other people. That true fiscal responsibility includes genuine responsibility for the well-being of others in our community. That authentic financial security comes from understanding that we're all vulnerable to circumstances beyond our individual control, and therefore morally obligated to help each other during the inevitable difficult times that define human existence. Michael thought he was teaching me important lessons about fiscal responsibility by cutting off support for charitable giving that represented less than 2% of my monthly budget. Instead, he taught me that financial knowledge without compassion is genuinely dangerous, that judgment without understanding is fundamentally cruel, and that family members who withdraw support based on disagreement about spending priorities don't deserve continued access to the financial security they claim to value above human relationships and family loyalty. Some lessons about money can only be learned through comprehensive loss, and Michael discovered that financial success without family support is ultimately hollow and meaningless.